We're following breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ. Dan Quinn has reached a verbal agreement to become the next head coach of the Washington Commanders. That's the latest from our NFL insider, Jonathan Jones. Quinn has spent the past 4 seasons as the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys. Before that, he spent 6 seasons as head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, leading them to a Super Bowl berth in Super Bowl 51. It also marks the first major move for the new ownership group led by Josh Harris and general manager Adam Peters. The Commanders are coming off a 4-13 season and now bring in Quinn, who, as mentioned, defensive coordinator for the Cowboys. He was the AP Assistant Coach of the Year in 2021. He did win a Super Bowl with the Seahawks in 2013 as a defensive coordinator, but then, of course, 2016 lost that Super Bowl when he was with the Atlanta Falcons. 43-42 is his record in 6 seasons in the ATL. All right, let's bring in Pick 6 podcast guy John Breech to talk about this. Breech, first, I'll just start by getting your reaction here. We had heard stuff last night that Quinn could be the guy, but now it comes to pass. He's the next coach of the Commanders. So what are your thoughts on this?
I'm a little surprised, Jeremy. I will be honest. This does not seem like the direction this hiring was going to go 48 hours ago. When we're thinking about the fact that Ben Johnson was out there, when Mike Macdonald was still out there, and of course Ben Johnson decides to stay in Detroit, the Seahawks get Mike Macdonald, and it really feels like the Commanders are going with option B, maybe even option C here with Dan Quinn. And when you're bringing in a defensive coach and you look at the other defensive coaches that are out there, we're talking about Mike Vrabel, we're talking about Bill Belichick, and you bring in Dan Quinn, it just feels like that's maybe not the hire that's going to inspire this fan base. And you mentioned Josh Harris. You're a new owner. Maybe you want to make a big splash. You go get someone big, but you settle on Dan Quinn. So to me, it is a very interesting hire, but he is someone who's very familiar with the Cowboys. You want to bring in a guy who could immediately compete in the NFC East, improve your defense. I do think Dan Quinn can do that part. So in that sense, this is not a horrible hire, but certainly it does raise some questions.
Yeah, we saw what he did with that Cowboys defense, but this is a Commanders defense that got rid of a lot of their young talent last season, getting rid of Montez Sweat, Chase Young, I mean, guys on the defensive side of the ball. So when he takes over this team, what type of a team is he getting?
Yeah, I mean, he is obviously going to have to spend a lot of the offseason upgrading the defense, not to mention you still have to find a quarterback. And this Commanders defense was bad in 2023. They gave up the most yards per game of any team in the NFL. They gave up the most points per game. So Dan Quinn is essentially starting from scratch on that side of the ball. But again, that's why you bring someone like him in, because you know that he could probably improve this defense quickly. And you look at what he did in Dallas. I mean, the 3 seasons he was there, the Cowboys had a top 5 defense every single year. You look at a big reason the Falcons were successful because Dan Quinn turned that defense around. So he has, and obviously you mentioned his time in Seattle, the Legion of Boom. They went to 2 Super Bowls with Dan Quinn there. So he did a great job in Seattle, great job in Atlanta, great job in Dallas on the defensive side of the ball. And I think the Commanders are obviously expecting him to kind of have that quick turnaround in Washington.
And they have the number 2 pick and a boatload of money. So, I mean, the resources are there for him to really make an impact on this team right away.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is what you want to do, because you have to answer the quarterback question. That is the very first thing you need to do when you walk in the door, even though there are a lot of question marks on defense. It is, do you keep Sam Howell? Do you draft a quarterback 2nd overall, which I think is probably where they're going to be leaning? And then once you figure out what you're going to do at quarterback, then maybe you can pay attention to a little bit more what you're going to do on the defensive side of the ball. But as you said, it's not just the number 2 overall pick with the resources. They have a ton of cap money going into free agency. So they absolutely have the resources to build this team this offseason and make it a team that can at least sniff going above 500 in next season. So this is, if you're Dan Quinn, this is a very attractive job for you because of the resources you have with the high draft picks and the amount of salary cap money the team will work with in free agency.
7 straight seasons without a winning record in Washington. All right, so Breech, let's talk about the money here. I mean, if you had that kind of cash in front of you, how are you spending it? Who are you going after?
Well, look, I think that there's so many holes on this roster. You're thinking, hey, do I go out and get a couple big-name free agents and spend a huge chunk of money grabbing 1 or 2 guys that I really need? or am I looking for role players and trying to sign 5 or 6 guys that can come in and improve my defense right away? So I think that is the one thing they have to decide. I don't think they need to go out in free agency and try and hit a home run, because this is not a team that's 1 or 2 players from being a Super Bowl contender. They're 1 or 2 players away from being 5 or 6 players away. So this is a team that's absolutely going to need to build its roster. So I think that is what we'll see them do come March, is kind of make these smaller signings, and then you go for the home run with your number 2 overall pick in the NFL draft.
One of the things, I mean, we mentioned names Bill Belichick and Mike Vrabel, guys who at this point in time, at least in this latest coaching cycle, do not have jobs. The last opening has now been filled. So, I mean, Breech, when you look at it, I don't know if you want to say these guys are getting a year off, or maybe there's some jobs that are going to come up after we get into the offseason. But, I mean, what does this NFL look like without, certainly Bill Belichick would be the first time since 1974 that he's not been part of this league.
Yeah, it's crazy to even think about. I mean, most NFL fans weren't even alive the last time Belichick. I certainly wasn't alive. The one thing I will say as this relates to the Commanders is that this actually feels like it puts a lot of pressure on Dan Quinn, because you didn't get a Vrabel or you didn't get a Belichick. Usually when you're walking into a situation where you're the head coach of a team that's got 7 straight losing records, there's not a lot of pressure on you in year 1 because you're trying to rebuild the team. But when the fan base can say, well, why did we go 5-12 in 2024? Well, we had Mike Vrabel out there. We had Bill Belichick out there. I mean, say what you want about Belichick, but this guy is arguably the greatest defensive mastermind in NFL history. Mike Vrabel's out there, and it does feel like those guys are 2 coaches who probably want a little more power and a little more say when it comes to the personnel situations, when it comes to the NFL draft, and that's maybe why the Commanders passed on them. But it is crazy to think that we're going to go into an NFL season without Bill Belichick. So, and it's almost impossible to imagine getting hired. I don't think he would take a defensive coordinator job. So it really feels like we are going to be seeing no Bill Belichick for the first time since 1974.
Well, and who knows? I mean, Jerry Jones said that he could absolutely work with Belichick. Maybe there's a special consultant that maybe gets added to that name. As you mentioned, not going to be the defensive coordinator. But good stuff as always, Breech. Good to have you as part of this. John Breech covering some breaking news for us. Dan Quinn agreeing to a verbal agreement with the Commanders to become their next head coach. They'll be talking about this, Breech and the crew, over on the Pick 6 podcast. You can download and follow wherever you get your podcast audio, or scan that QR code to listen to the latest episode now and watch that feed for an emergency pod later today.